Today's podcast will provide our listeners a general introduction to the rather complicated subject of Buddhism. This fascinating topic should be relevant to all of our listeners because the faith is now cosmopolitan in distribution and attracts more than 500 million followers worldwide. Buddhism deserves, from the outset, a few introductory comments, because much of what you have heard about the Buddha and his unique brand of religious expression has been colored by a popular supposition that the famous sage of the Shakya clan was a walking, talking, charismatic man that communicated some original and highly influential insights into the human condition. I intend to demonstrate that this general viewpoint is highly questionable. I do so because the Buddha was a mythic figure whose life story was no less fantastic than the tales of, let's say Rama or Krishna, his contemporaries in Hindu tradition. And I think few, if any, serious historians have ever asserted or even suggested that Krishna and Rama were veritable human beings. Moreover, most fundamental creeds in Buddhist schools of religion, and there are many schools of Buddhism, offer very few original contributions to Aryan metaphysical principles, and hardly anything that is new to Aryan mythical themes and doctrines that were circulating among Hindu communities during the age of the latest Buddha. So Buddhism is essentially a slightly heterodox sect of Brahmanism. The popularity and influence of Buddhism in history owes in large part to the spiritual promise the tradition held, or perhaps I should say holds, for your average Joe on the street. As we discuss in our episodes on Hinduism and the Upanishads, Brahmanic communities during the early years of Buddhism pretty much restricted the pursuit of enlightenment to members of the priest class, the Brahmins, whose members were largely determined by India's caste system. This was based primarily on one's family pedigree and male birthright. Buddhism was open, however, to anybody that chose to walk the Buddha's walk, which they called the dharmapada, and or to talk the Buddha's talk, which they refer to as the Dharma. Another distinguishing feature of Buddhism is that its philosophical views and doctrines derive from the thoughts and actions of a single sage, a single person, that being the famous seer of ancient India, known as Siddhartha Gautama. Siddhartha was a Shramana, which is to say he was a seeker of enlightenment, even though he lacked the status of a priest in Brahmanic circles and lacked the required Vedic catechisms that normally attend entry into those circles. But much as his Brahmanic associates, Siddhartha sought to find peace in his lifetime by discovering a means by which to escape rebirth into the material world, which is invariably attended by suffering and pain. So clearly, there is no actual difference between the ultimate goal of a Brahmin sage and a Shramana. The specific spiritual methods and philosophies that the Buddha discovered and preached about in his long and eventful life are actually a little difficult to pin down with specificity and precision, because Buddhist doctrine and practices have developed and diverged along many distinctive parallel philosophical lines of reasoning, mostly due to the isolation of Buddhist communities in the far-flung corners of ancient Asia. And naturally, most geographically isolated communities recognized their own schools of Buddhism as the veritable, authentic path to spiritual emancipation. So there are, in fact, many types of Buddhisms around the world. From the Theravadan Buddhists, the so-called elder tradition on the island of Sri Lanka, on the southeast end of India, to the Chan tradition of China, or the Pure Land, the Shingon, and the Zen schools of Buddhism in Japan. All of these schools of Buddhist doctrine come from a common source, much as the colorful tantric schools of Vajrayana Buddhism that we find throughout the Himalayas. But each of these schools has promoted its own divergent views on the Buddhist doctrine, known as Dharma. And as a consequence, there is considerable disagreement among modern scholars as to what were the exact views and the philosophical predilections of the man we know as Siddhartha Gautama. If we consider the common philosophical and doctrinal threads that are shared by all of these schools of Buddhism, and then consider these commonalities in the context of world history, there is no denying that the basic doctrinal tenets of Buddhism were inherited from early Aryan, that would be Brahmanic schools of mythology and metaphysics. For Buddhists actually recognized and worshipped members of the prehistoric Vedic pantheon in the same manner as did Hindu communities of this age. They, not unlike their Brahmanic associates, embraced, for example, the doctrines of karma and rebirth. Just as Buddhists envisioned our lives on earth as something of a dream, an unreal figment of our imaginative minds, which we, the unenlightened, believe to be real. Like their Hindu associates, Buddhists describe each individual's passage through birth, through life, and through death as a flowing through, aka samsara. This being a Sanskrit term and concept, connotes one's participation in creation's life stream. Buddhists believed that rebirth into samsara, the flow of life, was perpetuated by a person's desires for pleasure, individual identity, and superiority, and that these desires result in our inherent longing for possessions and personal preeminence. Buddhists shared a common belief in a person's past incarnations, which need not be human, while distinguishing the heavenly realms of the gods from the material world that we mere mortals inhabit. To transcend the urgings of rebirth, a devotee of the Buddha sought to comprehend the meaning of the sage's dharma, or dhamma, a Sanskrit term, dharma, for cosmic order, truth, and religious doctrine. So if you have already checked out our episodes on the Vedas, the Upanishads, and Hinduism, you are prepared now to tackle the essentials of the Buddha's teachings. The origin of Buddhism is, in many ways, as obscure as the origin of South Asian Vedism. Vedism referring to a religious tradition of prehistoric Aryan tribes that prospered in ancient India and Pakistan some 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, if not earlier. Buddhism and Vedism are both ancient religious traditions based on mythic lore that predates literary records, and they both are of Aryan origin. In fact, the early religious perspectives and practices of ancient Vedists actually set the historical stage for the eventual development of three of the world's so-called great religions, namely Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism. And without a doubt, the most widespread and influential of these three denominations, at least in terms of the sheer numbers of devotees in human history and their geographical reach in Asia, is unquestionably Buddhism. Historians that study Buddhism have long understood that the tradition rose in popularity around 400 years before the dawn of the Christian era, apparently as a viable alternative for commoners and women alike to participate in a personal quest for a spiritual emancipation. Early Buddhist communities adopted their slightly heterodox practices around 2,400 years ago, which allowed any aspiring individual to enter monasteries and nunneries to seek and follow a path to spiritual enlightenment that Siddhartha Gautama had established for the benefit of human aspirants. The social and spiritual milieu in which Buddhism developed is presently understood on the basis of written and artistic records that are primarily mythic in content. The sacred texts of Buddhism document in surprising detail the mystical events that characterize their founders' life, times, and beliefs, as well as the religious views and directions that Siddhartha taught his disciples, such that they and their followers might also reach the goal of their master, which was a divine state of being called Maha-Sambodhi, meaning a great awakenment. Both myth and doctrine describe this state of mind, or maybe I should say this state of being, in terms of everlasting bliss and a permanent escape from one's rebirth into a future life of pleasure and pain. Individuals that attained the awakened state, described as bodhi, would assume the title and stature of a Buddha or Bodha, which is not a name of a person, but rather a title, like doctor or professor or laureate. It is noteworthy that during the age of Siddhartha, Buddhist records attest to the attainment of Bodhi by thousands of the Buddha's followers, which contrasts remarkably, I might add, to our present-day situation, in which hardly anybody would stake claim to the status of an arhat, an achieved enlightened sage, among the faith's 500 million participants today. Obviously, something has gone missing. By tradition, Buddhists acknowledge that their gods, their sages, and close-knit Aryan communities trace their origins from widely scattered Aryan tribes that once populated northwestern India, Central Asia, and eventually the Gangetic Plains, at least a millennium before the appearance of Siddhartha himself. The four so-called noble truths of Buddhism are known actually literally as the four Aryan truths. So that term, Aryan, which means noble, or otherwise refers to a racial pedigree, a tribal alliance, has a very different connotation in the past than it does in the modern world, or at least since the advent of World War II. As does the swastika, which is a standard symbol for the Buddha and the prehistoric Aryan tribes. So it should come as little surprise that the gods and goddesses to which Buddhists have always paid reverence were the same deities that their distant Aryan ancestors worshipped during prehistoric ages. In contrast to Brahmanic societies, Buddhist monks and their laity proclaimed a pacifistic walk of life that eschewed all military service and commercial activities. Most serious monks, even today, would vow to never even touch a weapon or any sort of money. This distinguished them from many Brahmin priests of their day, most of whom prospered financially by performing ritual sacrifices of animals for the benefit of aristocrats, militarists, and merchants. Buddhist communities required, or at least recommended, that their monks, nuns, and laity pursue an ascetic or at least a pacifistic, forest-dwelling or monastic way of life. The famous Prince Siddhartha Gautama maintained that the abandonment of worldly desires and activities were essential for the attainment of spiritual enlightenment, and he recommended that his disciples follow the example of his own life, various aspects of which deviate from standard codes of moral and civil conduct that were followed by Brahmin priests of his day. One of these deviations relates to the practice of animal sacrifices, which were quite popular at this juncture in Indian history and were performed daily or during religious festivals by priests with the professed intention of seeking favor from this or that Brahmanic god. Buddhists prohibited absolutely any sort of harm to all living creatures. In fact, this prohibition was normally listed as rule number 1. The life of Siddhartha began near the village of Kapilavastu in the Terai lowlands of what we call today Nepal. And his life ended no more than 60 miles away from his birthplace in the village of Kushinagar of modern Bihar, India. Over the course of several centuries following Siddhartha's extraordinary life, followers of the Buddha disseminated their unique brand of religion across the lowland tropics of India, above and beyond the foothills and high valleys of the Himalayas, across the plains and gorges of northern Afghanistan, and then into the southern reaches of tropical India, falling over to the island of Sri Lanka. By 500 AD, Buddhist monks introduced their tradition to China and the Far East, including Japan and southward into the Indonesian archipelago. These movements owe historically to the waning influences of the religion in its place of origin, since the turn of the 8th century, at which time the prestige and impacts of Buddhism was either subordinated or diluted by Hindu beliefs and Hindu followers. Interestingly, native Buddhist communities that prosper in India today are actually comprised of Tibetan exiles that escaped communist attacks on their tradition during the 1950s. Most scholars must turn, therefore, to a very rich body of historical records that account for the life and times of the Buddha from many and distant regions of continental Asia. Regionally distinctive texts and doctrines were preserved and later uncovered from the isolated island of Sri Lanka on the southeast tip of India, from various disjunct riverine oases of Central Asia, and from various famous monasteries in China, Nepal, Burma, Cambodia, Thailand, and Tibet. It turns out that the oldest known Buddhist records were recorded in the language of Pali, a dialect of northern Indian origin that survived the destructive impacts of history in the southernmost Buddhist outposts of Sri Lanka. This is where monastic communities conserved an exceptionally rich body of literature on the faith, much of which dates from the turn of the 1st century BC. Sri Lankan monasteries have served the tradition more as a refugium than an original source of the tradition. And to be sure, the monastic brand of Buddhism that blossomed in Sri Lanka around 2 centuries before the turn of the Common Era, this being at least 3 centuries after the supposed life and times of Siddhartha, actually deviates substantially from the original practices of the famous sage of the Shakya clan. Because Siddhartha achieved his divine stature as a solitary and decidedly independent forest-dwelling sage in northern India. He had no guru and had no monastery. Sri Lanka preserved a canon of texts that is pretty substantial in size. known as the Pali Canon, because it's conserved in the language of Pali. The scriptures were reportedly compiled around 400 years after the miraculous birth and death of Siddhartha, and it's organized collectively into three major classes of references known as the Tipitaka, the three baskets. Representing the oldest available manuscripts of Buddhist tradition, they are often regarded as the least corrupt of the known Buddhist sources. However, these documents are likely based on older Prakrit and Sanskrit literary sources before they made their way to the southern extremes of the Indian subcontinent, and then across the Gulf of Mannar to the island of Sri Lanka. This being the case, they too probably preserve a number of regional adulterations of a tradition that arose on the Gangetic Plains several centuries earlier. And in truth, the Pali Canon is not actually that much older than the canonical texts from regions of Asia that lie to the north of the Ganges River, and these are recorded in the language of Sanskrit. These northern scriptures trace their origins from Central Asia and China, and had considerable impact on the composition and refinement of Buddhist texts in Nepal, Tibet, Eastern Iran, and Japan. So all of these records have their own historical backgrounds, and therefore often express somewhat different points of religious dogma. So I will follow an approach on Paradise Earth that seeks to recognize those mythic themes and doctrinal tenets that are common to all of these ancient sources and texts, as a means to get to the bottom of what Buddhism was originally all about. In today's podcast, I will propose that the famous sage of the Shakya clan, born to the famous Lumbini Grove of southern Nepal, was less a man than an all too familiar reiteration of a mythical Aryan divine personage. Fundamentally, the Buddha was a human avatar of a deity that descended from a lotus grove in the heavens to show humanity the way to bliss in the guise of yet another lotus-seated god. Siddhartha's familiar and often quite realistic, iconic images in Asia's historical past have led most historians to believe that we are actually dealing on some level with an historical and highly charismatic individual whose life was eventually mythologized to enhance his religious bona fides. But we shall see in our videos on the history of Buddhist symbolism and the widely circulating biographies of the man that Siddhartha Gautama was a god. And it turns out that the basic doctrinal tenets of Buddhism deviate very little from earlier Brahmanic concepts expressed in the Upanishads, which we cover in a podcast on Soma and the Vedas in substantial detail. And the most salient theme that holds Buddhist and Upanishadic doctrines together, in a way, is the role of the sacred lotus in explaining and exemplifying a divine relationship between humanity's spiritual experience of ecstasy and this sacred plant, the lotus. In recalling our inquiry into a compelling Brahmanic aphorism of the Upanishads, and I'll quote, "You are the one lotus blossom. May I become the lotus among men." This expression dating 3 or 4 centuries before Buddhist tradition, I will attempt to demonstrate that the life of the Buddha is no more than a variation on this all too familiar Indian theme. Because the Buddha is essentially a personification of the sacred lotus plant, which makes him a plant god, just like Vedic Soma. And I will argue that the prehistoric ritualized practice of drinking a liquid extract from the Soma plant to experience simultaneously the sensations of omniscience and mindlessness, is perfectly consistent with Buddhist mythology and doctrine. For around 2,400 years ago, Siddhartha himself climbed upon Brahma's golden flower, which he referred to as a bodhimanda, a wheel of awakening, on which he attained immortality. We will see that various Pali and Sanskrit texts refer to this state of mind as Brahmabhuto, meaning literally one that has become as Brahma. And Brahma himself, of course, sits himself conventionally on a lotus flower. But here's the real rub in Buddhist mythology. Siddhartha attempted using yogic practices and self-mortification for many years with a group of forest dwellers to attain enlightenment. But he discovered that these methods do not result in the achievement of everlasting bliss. Rather, Siddhartha experiences nirvana after he abandons the practice of yoga and meditation in Indian forests and proceeds directly to a riverbank to drink the famous Aryan nectar of immortality, known as Soma. And this mythic and to a certain extent historical theme, since people really did drink Soma, is fundamental to the Soma experience of the prehistoric Vedas. Strangely, at least to me, this crucial incident in the life of Siddhartha has escaped the notice of most translators and modern commentators. Several notable trends in the historical development of Buddhism appear to parallel developments in Vedic and post-Vedic Brahmanic mythology, Hindu mythology. Like the lives of most Aryan gods, the life of a Buddha begins and ends in the fantastical realms of myth. As the story goes, prior to the Buddha's final birth on earth, this seeker of enlightenment had already passed many successive world eons of time, enthroned upon a lotus flower in a paradise of the heavens known as Tushita. In Tushita heaven, the bodhisattva, that is, an awakened being that has committed to return to earth in order to lead living creatures on a path to spiritual redemption, undertakes his final rebirth in the guise of a prince to a minor Indian kingdom. Once born to earth, he chooses early on in life to adopt the lifestyle of an ascetic forest dweller while abandoning his life as the royal heir to his father's prosperous kingdom. He does this with an aim to show his family and his subjects a way to transcend the ever-beckoning cycles of suffering and death. Biographical accounts of Siddhartha Gautama are often recorded in the form of a sermon, and they usually describe the sage as a resplendent, golden-hued man that sits himself within the petals of an awakened lotus flower. This archetypal image implies, obviously, that the sage is more a god than a mortal man. And to be sure, the more substantial chapters of this god's fabulous life clearly arise from the fertile fields of Vedic mythology instead of human history. Records of the Buddha's life and times involve far too many divine beings and wondrously fantastical scenarios to be considered an historical account of anything. And yet, most modern scholars seem intent on envisaging the man as a charismatic historical figure whose life was belatedly recorded in the context of a myth. On Paradise Earth, we take historical records at face value and attempt to view these records objectively. In fact, all the major schools of Buddhism identify the famous sage of the Shakya clan literally as a devati-deva, which means a god of the gods. This is tantamount to saying that the Buddha is Brahman. Buddhist doctrine focuses primarily on philosophical and metaphysical ideas, but it almost always frames each religious or philosophical point in the context of the Buddha's mythic background. His ideas cannot be separated from his mythical character. And both of these aspects of Buddhist tradition address the same theological questions and philosophical themes that occupied the authors of the Upanishads in earlier centuries. In fact, Buddhist doctrine itself insists that the ultimate reality is above and beyond anything that relates to the name of and form of any living creatures, humans included. This notion is perfectly compatible with all things that we consider to be part of Hindu doctrine. There is, of course, an historical dimension to all mythic traditions, insofar as mythical tales spring from the human imagination during specific time periods and places in human history. But attempts to authenticate the life of a mythic figure in terms of human history are bound to confuse the fundamental intentions of most myths, and that is to elucidate and describe universal principles by means of metaphors, allegories, and symbolism. And in this connection, we cannot ignore that Prince Siddhartha's physique, associations, and religious goals were modeled after the standard physical attributes and behaviors of prehistoric Brahmanic divinities, which we discuss in our episodes on Vedism. These divinities would include Purusha, Brahma, Hiranyagarbha, Vishnu, and Krishna. And we should recognize that the title of Buddha was never meant to imply a specific person or deity, such as Jesus, the one and only begotten Son of God the Father, but rather a class of enlightened human avatars that are believed to appear repeatedly and continuously on earth over the course of countless Buddha eons. Furthermore, the oldest known biographical sources of the latest Buddha indicate that young Prince Siddhartha would have never sought or found spiritual emancipation were it not for the intercession of, quote-unquote, the gods, including especially the Vedic creator god Brahma and the Vedic storm god Indra. These same gods are even still celebrated by Central Asian, Chinese, and Japanese schools of Mahayana Buddhism, some of which even still worship in Buddhist ritual the Vedic gods known as Soma, Indra, Agni, and Surya. The truly historical records, as opposed to mythic records, of Buddhism begin not with the mythic figure of Prince Siddhartha, but with the reign of an historical king of ancient India by the name of Ashoka. This famous dynast was the grandson of India's well-known monarch, Chandragupta Maurya, whose historical place in history is mentioned by various Greek and Roman historians. Written records of Ashoka in India reveals a king that arose in aristocratic ranking while first serving as a prince and a viceroy on the western border of his grandfather's vast empire during the Mauryan period, being around 3rd century BC or so. In this capacity, Ashoka served as a ruler over territories that happened to fall within the Vedic domains of the land of the 5 rivers, today's Punjab. Ashoka governed this region of the world from the ancient city of Takshila, an important trade post in antiquity, whose ruins can still be visited today not far from the modern city of Islamabad in Pakistan. Ashoka eventually assumed the throne and expanded his rule over lands that stretched from the mouth of the Ganges River to the Hindu Kush of Afghanistan. Unambiguous evidence on his reign is preserved unwritten edicts that Ashoka had inscribed on the face of cliffs, on stone outcrops, and on sandstone lotus columns that he erected throughout his kingdom. So this is truly history. These inscriptions make perfectly clear that the king was a follower of the Buddha, but not exclusively so. For he was a benefactor of all Aryan traditions that based their moral codes of conduct on the general concept of dharma. So that would include Buddhist, Jain, and Hindu subjects at this time, among others. These stone inscriptions make reference to the king's early years as a successful militarist, for which he expresses a lot of remorse in his writings, his inscriptions. But only after he had established full control over most of India. And I think it's probably fair to say that he likely planned to exploit the pacifistic inclinations of Buddhist societies to serve as a means to subdue and stabilize social changes that were rampant in his growing empire. Ashoka's life marks the beginning, then, of Buddhist history, per se. But we're more interested here in the famous sage and his sacred flower. As is our standard practice on Paradise Earth, our videos will explore these two elements together, divine man and sacred flower, to provide our followers some new and compelling, and I think original, insights into the origin and meaning of Buddhist tradition. Or I should say, Buddhist traditions. And we shall make the case that the Buddha is no more than the personification of a force of nature that had exacted influence over Aryan brotherhoods long before the advent of Buddhism. And that force of nature is actually the plant of the Vedic gods, Soma, the traditional Aryan source of immortality and everlasting bliss.